In this last video on Madison and the War of 1812, we'll look at the peace treaty that ended the war. Peace efforts had actually begun soon after the fighting began. After all, the British had repealed their orders in council, their restrictions on trade, before the Americans' declaration of war, which is what the Americans were demanding. They had started negotiating, but the sticking point had remained that Americans wanted the British to give up their impressment of American sailors, and the British refused to because the British needed that labor, those soldiers, to keep fighting France. But after Napoleon failed, then the British had no more need for impressment, and they're more amenable to negotiations. A lot of the negotiations had been sort of mediated by the leader of Russia, Tsar Alexander. And President Jackson had dispatched John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, and several other diplomats to St. Petersburg as early as 1813 to negotiate. And they had to wait a while because the Tsar was at the front of Napoleonic Wars. But at the end of the war, eventually the British agreed to talk directly. And so John Quincy Adams and his American diplomatic colleagues went to the city of Ghent in Belgium, where they would negotiate directly. By the way, among the American delegates with John Quincy Adams was the Kentuckian Henry Clay I had mentioned in an earlier video. The result was the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ended the War of 1812. Here you can see a picture of John Quincy Adams and the Brown in the middle shaking the hands with the British leader. The British had first demanded a lot of things. They wanted territory in New York. They wanted the removal of all American warships on the Great Lakes. They even wanted the creation of an Indian buffer state up there along the Great Lakes. And they wanted access all the way down the Mississippi River and fishing rights in the Atlantic. And the Americans were, of course, not a chance. They had fought the British to an even stand. And, the British were, this point, they wanted to get it wrapped up because the British merchants, had been paying larger taxes for the war. Britain had been at war, and they just wanted to be at peace and get trade on. So under pressure from their own merchants, the British dropped their demands. And the result was that the Treaty of Ghent basically just called for status quo antebellum. Basically, things would just go on exactly as they were before the war. Each side would return prisoners. They respect previous boundaries, and they agreed to establish a commission to study equitable fishing rights. But they're really the core issues. They just left the same, and it was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. The thing was, while the treaty had been signed, the Battle of New Orleans had taken place about the same time, and the news of the American victory at the Battle of New Orleans reached Americans before news of the Treaty of Ghent. And so, they get this news of a great American victory, and then they get the news of a peace treaty. And Americans took that to mean, hey, we won. In actuality, it was kind of a draw, and status quo antebellum means everything's the same as before. There really wasn't a victor, but the impression among Americans was that they had won the war. And this is going to, create a real sense of national pride all across America. As if to prove their newfound national pride, Congress immediately launched a quick, decisive blow to the pirates on Barbary Coast. There had been relative peace there, but during the War of 1812, figuring that the U.S. couldn't defend them, the pirates had resumed attacking American merchant vessels. Well, now, all pumped up on their victory in the Battle of New Orleans, the U.S. sent Stephen Decatur, the hero of the earlier conflict with the pirates, along with 10 ships to the Mediterranean, where he kicked their butt. This time there was no tribute paid to the pirates, and indeed the pirates themselves agreed to pay the American an indemnity, and this was the end to any piracy of the American on the American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. All of this action and the supposed victory in the War of 1812, the impression that we won the war in the Treaty of Ghent, this is going to diminish partisan feelings, and this sense of national pride will follow Madison and the rest of his presidency and that of his successor, James Monroe. And historians have taken to refer to this period as the era of good feelings, a period that will be discussed later on. I should note that this sense that America had won, this sense that the war was good and there was a lot of national pride, man, it kind of doomed the Federalist Party, which of course had been so against the war. Angered both by the war and an increased immigration to the South and the West, right before the Battle of New Orleans, a bunch of Federalists had met in Hartford, Connecticut for 3 weeks. And there they were trying to consolidate their power in New England, and they even talked of a secession, that New England would break away. The Hartford Convention's moderates prevented it, but they did officially declare that the War of 1812 was wrong, and they proposed radical changes in the Constitution. They wanted to restrict the president to 1 term and require 2/3 congressional vote to admit new states to the Union. And they wanted to forbid all naturalized citizens from holding any public office. You know, all those immigrants are voting Democrat, Republican. And of course, the timing of this Hartford Convention just could not have been worse. It was not just as news that the Battle of New Orleans arrived, but the sense of nationalism that resulted from that pretty much discredited the Federalists. They looked disloyal, and they began to break up. Only a handful of states after the Hartford Convention, really a handful of Federalist parties in the states survived until the 1820s. Famous Federalist leaders like Daniel Webster, who I mentioned earlier, he was probably the most famous, and he was discredited, you know, and he's never going to become president as a result. The Federalist Party sort of fading, and the Democratic Republican Party, the party in Madison, apparently having been, you know, the party leading us into the war that was now perceived as so great, and the fact that Madison had begun to move away from the old Jeffersonian idealistic vision of a nation of independent yeoman farmers, had begun to embrace commerce more. All of this sort of diminished partisan tensions and made the era of good feelings a real sense of national unity. In any event, this concludes the videos on the presidency of James Madison and the War of 1812.